Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but they've left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases, guys. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Now, imagine this. You are working at a busy restaurant, just trying to get through your shift. The dinner crowd is in full swing. And suddenly, a masked man bursts through the door with a gun, demanding money. What do you do? Well, that's exactly what happened in Houston not all that long ago. And here we're going to dive into a case that has sparked endless debate. Was it self-defense? Or did things go too far? Stick with me to find out more about this controversial case that left many people asking, where is the line between defending yourself and becoming the aggressor? All right, well, now that you've imagined yourself in that restaurant, let's get into this. Let's bring you back to the actual case that has divided public opinion here. It's January 5th, 2023, not that long ago, in Houston, Texas. A quiet Thursday evening at a local taqueria. Families are seated enjoying their meals when suddenly the mood shifts. A masked man holding what appears to be a gun storms in. His voice cuts through the room as he demands money and wallets and anything of value from the customers. The atmosphere is thick with fear. The patrons do not know if they're about to become victims of a violent crime. But sitting among them is a man with a concealed handgun. He's been watching the robber, waiting for the right moment to act. As the masked man starts to exit the restaurant with the stolen goods, this customer seizes his chance. He pulls out his gun and fires. He fires 9 times, and the robber falls to the ground. In the chaos that follows, it becomes clear that the robber's weapon wasn't real. This was a plastic replica. But the fact that the gun was fake does not erase the very real danger that the diners felt. For a moment, it seems like the customer has acted heroically, saving lives and stopping a robbery in progress. But here's that moment, as with every story in this podcast. Here is where the story takes a turn. Of the 9 shots fired, the first few were likely seen as self-defense, but what about the last one? Witnesses claim the final shot was delivered when the robber was already down, raising a troubling question. Was this still self-defense at that point? Or did the customer's actions cross the line into something more unnecessary, like unnecessary use of deadly force? Texas has long been known for its stand your ground law. Texas is tough, and this law gives individuals the right to use deadly force when they believe their life or the lives of others are in immediate danger. But this case brings up a complex issue. When does self-defense turn into excessive force? Was the customer protecting himself and others, or did he go too far when he delivered that last fatal shot? Today we're going to dive into the facts, exploring both sides of this argument, and ultimately asking the question that has kept people debating since that night. Was this murder? Or was this self-defense? And this brings us to the heart of the debate. Imagine yourself in that restaurant once again. You've just witnessed a terrifying robbery in progress. The gunman's mask conceals his face. His gun is pointed at innocent people. And for a moment, you truly believe that lives are at stake. Then in the blink of an eye, a man pulls out a gun and fires 9 shots. Relief washes over the room. The threat has been neutralized. Or so it seems. But now, as the dust settles, questions start to emerge, as they seem to always do. Why the 9 shots? The initial rounds fired at the robber may have been necessary, but what about that final shot? Witnesses claim the shooter approached the already down man and fired a shot directly at his head, an act that some are calling an execution. Was it still self-defense at that point, or did the shooter go too far? And then the revelation hits. The robber's gun wasn't even real. It was a plastic replica. And does that change anything? Does it change anything in your mind? For the diners who had no way of knowing at the time, the fear they felt was very real. But what about the shooter? Could he have acted differently once the robber was down? This case taps into a much broader debate about the use of deadly force. Texas's Stand Your Ground law gives individuals the right to use lethal force if they feel that they believe their life or lives of others are in immediate danger. But it also raises the question, how do we define immediate danger? When the threat appears to be neutralized, how many shots are too many? When does self-defense turn into excessive force? And can we control our reactions when we do feel like our lives are threatened? And should that be considered? Was he still in defense mode when he gave that final shot? And what does that mean? Well, the answer might seem straightforward at first. If you're protecting yourself or others, you do what is necessary. But then we get to reality, right? The messy situations that actually happen. Cases like this are anything but clear. While some believe the shooter was simply defending the lives of the people in the restaurant, others argue that he crossed a moral and legal line when he fired that last shot. And another question here that some ask, the damage had already been done. This robber gunman threatened the lives of everyone in that restaurant. So who created the situation in the first place? And then, as a reactor, the shooter, is he fully responsible for all of his actions at that point? It is a mess. And then, of course, there's the matter of public perception, which is what we love discussing here because it matters. In the days following the shooting, the case made headlines with opinions on both sides of the spectrum. Some hailed the customer as a hero, praising his swift action in a dangerous situation. And then there were others that were more critical, asking why so many shots were fired and whether the shooter could have stopped after the initial volley. Could he control himself at that point, though? The media attention intensified when footage from the restaurant's security camera was released, showing the moments leading up to the shooting. The video revealed that after the robber was shot and fell to the ground, the shooter moved closer, firing additional rounds. While the first few shots were clearly in response to a perceived threat, those later shots, and particularly that last one, were what fueled the entire controversy. So here's the question for you. Was this a case of a man defending himself and others in a life and death situation? Or did he become the aggressor when he continued to fire after the threat was down? It's a tough call, and that's what we're going to explore in detail. And by the end of this episode, you're going to have all the hard facts, the arguments, and the controversy, and you'll have the chance to decide for yourself, was this murder or was this self-defense? On the evening of January 5th in 23, the incident at the Ranchito No. 4 Taqueria in southwest Houston unfolded like any other dinner service until a masked man entered the restaurant. The man was later identified as Eric Eugene Washington. He was armed with what appeared to be a firearm. He immediately began demanding money from all of the customers and threatening their lives while waving that gun around. The panic among the diners was palpable. Some people began handing over their wallets and their phones, while others were just frozen in fear. Washington moved quickly through the restaurant, gathering what he could from the terrified patrons. He was loud and aggressive and seemed intent on making a very quick getaway. At that moment, one of the customers, a man sitting with his back to the scene, decided to act. He stood up, drew his concealed handgun, and opened fire on Washington, who was facing away from him. In quick succession, he fired multiple rounds, hitting Washington several times, and Washington fell to the ground near the restaurant's exit. His body slumped over. But the situation didn't end there. The customer, whose identity was initially kept anonymous, he continued to approach Washington's lifeless body. And as he walked closer, witnesses say he fired several more shots, including a final one aimed directly at Washington's head. In total, 9 bullets were fired. It wasn't until after the shooting that the truth came to light. Washington's gun wasn't even real. It was that plastic replica designed to intimidate, but not capable of actually causing any harm. However, for the people in the restaurant that night, the fear was real. There was no way for the customer to know the gun was fake in the heat of those moments. The Houston Police Department arrived shortly after the shooting and began their own investigation. The shooter voluntarily remained on the scene to give his account of what happened. Surveillance footage from the restaurant also captured the entire incident, providing law enforcement with a clear view of the events that unfolded. But now the question remained, was the shooter justified in his use of deadly force? Or did his actions, especially those final shots, go too far? And should he be blamed for that? As the investigation progressed, details about both the shooter and the victim began to emerge. Eric Eugene Washington, the man who attempted the robbery, did have a criminal history, including previous charges for robbery and other violent offenses. Washington had been out on parole at the time of the incident, attempting to turn his life around, but he ultimately returned to a life of crime, as demonstrated by the events that unfolded on this particular night. The shooter, on the other hand, was an unnamed 46-year-old man with a legal concealed carry license. His decision to carry a firearm that evening was within the bounds of Texas law, and the initial response to his actions were largely positive. Many people praised the man for stepping in and protecting the innocent diners who could have easily been harmed in the robbery. Local media initially depicted him as a hero, someone who took control of a dangerous situation while others were helpless. However, as more information surfaced, particularly the footage from the restaurant's security cameras, the narrative began to shift. In the video, the first shots fired at Washington were at a moment when he was still standing and actively threatening the diners. The subsequent shots, especially that last one, delivered at close range, drew heavy scrutiny. Critics argued that the final shot seemed unnecessary, as Washington was already incapacitated and no longer posing a threat. The footage, combined with witness testimonies, raised questions about whether the shooter's actions after the initial threat was neutralized could still be considered self-defense. Texas law does allow for the use of deadly force to stop a threat, but there are limits. If the threat is no longer immediate, further use of force could be seen as excessive. This legal debate intensified when it was revealed that Washington's weapon was just a plastic replica. Some legal experts weighed in, suggesting that the shooter, though justified in initially pulling that trigger, might have crossed the line into excessive force, particularly when firing the 9th and final shot into Washington's head directly. Others maintain that the shooter had no way of knowing that gun was fake, and that under the circumstances, his fear for his safety and the safety of others was entirely reasonable. This is where those legal and moral lines blur. The case isn't simply about the legality of carrying a firearm or defending oneself. It's about how far that right extends. And that's always the scary question for all of us, right? You know you can defend yourself, but you're a little bit nervous about it because you might somehow become a murderer yourself. All right, well, as this case progressed, public opinion grew increasingly divided. On one side, supporters of the shooter argued he acted out of a reasonable fear for his life and the lives of others. Given the circumstances, especially with Washington appearing armed and dangerous, many felt the shooter had no choice but to act. In their eyes, he was protecting not only himself, but also the patrons of the restaurant who were at the mercy of a masked and aggressive robber. These supporters also pointed to Texas's Stand Your Ground law, which does not require a person to retreat if they believe they're in imminent danger. The shooter's actions, they believed, fell within the law's boundaries. There's always that other side, and they see things differently. For those critical of the shooter's decisions, the most concerning aspect was that final shot. People did not like that move. By the time that ninth bullet was fired, Washington was already incapacitated. He was lying on the ground and no longer posing an active threat. The video footage of the shooting kind of made it hard to ignore that final moment. When the shooter approached Washington's motionless body and fired at close range, to them that was not self-defense, it was unnecessary. It was an unnecessary escalation that crossed into excessive force. But his adrenaline was skyrocketing. He had just shot someone. We don't know if he's shot someone before. His adrenaline is flying as he's trying to stop someone who is presenting a danger. Does that final shot belong to him and his adrenaline? Was he thinking about it? And would he normally walk up to someone and just shoot them in the head? And does any of that even matter? Because it's excessive force or not? That's what the law says. And adding to the complexity of the case was the fact that Washington's gun was a plastic replica. And there's no way for the shooter or the diners to know that this was a plastic replica at the time, and some argued that it was a critical factor in determining whether the threat was even real. The question of whether the use of deadly force was justified became even more contentious when it was revealed that the shooter had taken Washington's gun and called the police himself after the incident. The legal investigation that followed all of this was centered around determining whether the shooter's use of force was reasonable under Texas law. Investigators interviewed witnesses, reviewed the surveillance footage, and analyzed the trajectory of the bullets. The central issue remained: was the shooter acting within his rights to defend himself and others, or did his actions, particularly that final shot, go too far? Ultimately, this case became a litmus test for how society views self-defense and the use of deadly force. It touched on larger issues about the role of firearms in public spaces, the responsibility of gun owners, and the limitations of self-defense laws. As we move forward, we're going to examine how these laws apply in this case and what both sides of the argument have to say about the shooter's intent that night. Okay, so now that we've presented the facts, let's get in a little deeper into the legal arguments made by both the prosecution and the defense. The defense, representing the shooter, argued that his actions were justified under Texas Stand Your Ground law, which permits individuals to use deadly force when they reasonably believe their life or the life of others is in immediate danger. The defense pointed to Washington's aggressive behavior, his demands for money while holding what appeared to be a gun, and the immediate fear instilled in every single person in that restaurant. Under these circumstances, the defense claimed the shooter had every reason to believe that Washington posed a deadly threat. He acted not only to protect himself, but also the other patrons who were essentially being held hostage during that robbery. A key point in the defense's argument was that Washington's gun, though later revealed to be a replica, it appeared very real in the moment. How many of you would be able to tell in a moment if someone rushed you with a gun? You're going to say, hey, excuse me, is that real? You're going to be afraid. And for the diners who had no way of knowing the gun wasn't even functional, that fear was authentic. The defense emphasized that self-defense laws are designed to protect individuals from having to make these split-second decisions during moments of intense fear and uncertainty, where that adrenaline gets going, right? They argued that even if Washington was down after the initial shots, it was reasonable for the shooter to continue firing because he had no way of knowing if Washington was fully incapacitated. Maybe he had other weapons. He wanted to finish the job and put the fear out. Furthermore, the defense highlighted Texas's laws regarding the protection of others. In cases where a person is defending third parties, like these other diners in the restaurant, the law actually allows for the use of deadly force if the individual reasonably believes that others are in imminent danger. The defense framed the shooter's actions as a necessary and heroic response to prevent potential casualties. What else could the guy have done? On the other hand, though, the prosecution focused on the excessive nature of force. While they conceded that the initial shots might have been justified, the prosecution argued that after Washington was down, no longer posing a threat, the shooter's decision to approach and fire one final shot was unnecessary and legally indefensible. They pointed to the surveillance footage, which showed the shooter standing over Washington before firing that final shot at close range. It gives an icky visual and it makes people uncomfortable. This, the prosecution claimed, was no longer self-defense at this point, but rather an overreaction, a moment where the shooter moved from defender to aggressor. They argued that the laws allow for the use of deadly force as long as there is an active and immediate threat. Active. So once Washington was incapacitated, the need for any further violence had ceased. But would you know all of that in the moment? And don't you just want to make sure you put that fear out? Not sure what's happening in the brain of the shooter, but clearly he has a job to do and he's trying to get it done. And this is all based on his fearful reaction from the shooter, right? Well, the prosecution didn't stop questioning the excessive nature of those final shots. They also brought the argument that the shooter had time to reassess the situation after firing those initial rounds. I mean, by the time he fired the last shot, Washington was down. He was not moving. He was not a threat. The video footage became a critical piece of evidence for the prosecution. They had cases that they brought up where people were held accountable for overstepping the bounds of self-defense. And they argued that this law doesn't give citizens carte blanche to just continue using deadly force when they don't need to. And then in addition to the legal arguments, the prosecution also emphasized the moral responsibility that comes with carrying a firearm. They argued that owning a gun, especially in public places, comes with a duty to act responsibly and with restraint. They suggested that while the shooter may have acted out of fear in the initial moments, the decision to fire the last shot was a choice made out of anger or frustration, not self-preservation. They painted a picture of a man who had crossed the line from being a protector to becoming an aggressor. The defense, of course, countered by reiterating that the shooter had no way of knowing whether Washington was still a threat or not. These things happen very quickly, and they maintained that in such high-stress situations, individuals just don't have the luxury of time to carefully evaluate every shot they fire, if guns are real. They argued it's easy to judge the shooter's actions in hindsight when you can see everything and look at it more slowly and more clearly. But in the moment, his decision to ensure that the threat was fully neutralized was reasonable. Ultimately, this case left many people questioning the limits of self-defense. At what point does a person stop being a defender and start becoming an aggressor? And in situations where fear and chaos reign, how much force is too much? And if someone decides to threaten someone else, do they then become the instigator of all things that follow? Would that shooter have had to do anything that day if that robber hadn't shown up? And when the adrenaline starts going and you are trying to protect yourself and others, you're being motivated by the threat that was presented to you by that other person. So who is responsible for those moments? It's a very tough question. And aside from responsibility, what is too much? And well, we have laid out the facts here. You have heard both sides of this argument. We looked into why this case remained so controversial, and now it's time to invite you, the listener, to make up your own mind on this. On one hand, the shooter acted in what he believed was a life-threatening situation. Eric Washington was masked, aggressive, and appeared to be armed with a gun, terrifying the patrons inside the restaurant. The shooter, a legally armed civilian, took action in what he saw as a necessary move to protect himself and others. Under Texas's Stand Your Ground law, the shooter had no obligation to retreat and was legally justified in using deadly force if he believed his life or the lives of others was in danger. Then there was that circumstance surrounding those final shots, right? Especially the ninth and last shot fired into Washington's head as the shooter stood over him. It raised serious questions. Was this threat still present? Was Washington, already on the ground and incapacitated, still a danger? And what does it say about the limits of self-defense when the line between protection and excessive force is blurred? In this case, the grand jury later decided not to file charges against the shooter, ruling that he acted in self-defense. And this decision sparked public debate, with some labeling the shooter as a vigilante, while others considered him a hero. This case highlights the complexities of self-defense laws and public perception regarding the use of force in dangerous situations. That's what happened in court, but the public remains divided, as do the legal experts who have also weighed in on this case. And now that you have heard the facts and the arguments, the question is, where do you stand? Was this an instance of a man simply protecting himself and others? Or did the shooter's actions cross the line into excessive force? If you were in that position, are you fully confident that you could control your emotional response and stop once that man was down? Imagine that you are in that restaurant, faced with the man holding what looks like a gun. Do you act quickly as the shooter did? Do you want to try to stop that threat? Or do you hesitate, wondering how much force is actually necessary? And again, can you control yourself in the moment? This is the dilemma that so many people face when they're considering this case. And as the legal system continues to wrestle with questions about self-defense and the boundaries of deadly force, I leave it for you to decide. Was this murder, or was it self-defense? Thank you for joining me on another case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Did the courts get it right on this one? The debate continues, but for now, it's up to you to decide where you stand. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. Stay curious. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.